Sawney Bean. The following account, now as well attested as any historical fact can be, is almost incredible for the monstrous and unparalleled barbarities that it relates, there being nothing that we ever heard of with the same degree of certainty that may be compared with it, or that shews how far a brutal temper untamed by education and knowledge of the world may carry a man in such glaring and horrible colours. Sawney Bean was born in the county of East Lothian, about 8 or 9 miles eastward of the city of Edinburgh, in the reign of James I of Scotland. His father was a hedger and ditcher and brought up his son to the same laborious employment. He got his daily bread in his youth by these means, but being very prone to idleness, and not caring to be confined to any honest employment, he left his father and mother and ran away into the desert part of the country, taking with him a woman as viciously inclined as himself. These two took up their habitation in a cave by the seaside on the shore of the county of Galloway, where they lived upwards of 25 years without going into any city, town, or village. In this time they had a great number of children and grandchildren whom they brought up after their own manner, without any notions of humanity or civil society. They never kept any company but among themselves, and supported themselves wholly by robbing, being moreover so very cruel that they never robbed anyone whom they did not murder. By this bloody method, and their being so retired from the world, they continued for a long time undiscovered, there being no person able to guess how the people were lost that went by the place where they lived. As soon as they had robbed any man, woman, or child, they used to carry off the carcass to the den, where, cutting it into quarters, they would pickle the mangled limbs and afterwards eat it, this being their only sustenance, and notwithstanding they were at last so numerous, they commonly had superfluity of their abominable food, so that in the night time they frequently threw legs and arms of the unhappy wretches they had murdered into the sea, at a great distance from their bloody habitation. The limbs were often cast up by the tide in several parts of the country, to the astonishment and terror of all beholders, and others who heard of it. Persons who have gone about their lawful occasions fell so often into their hands that it caused a general outcry in the country around about, no person knowing what was become of their friends or relations if they were once seen by these merciless cannibals. All the people in the adjacent parts were at last alarmed at such an uncommon loss of their neighbours and acquaintances, for there was no travelling in safety near the den of these wretches. This occasioned spies to be frequently sent into those parts, many of whom never returned again, and those who did, after the strictest search and inquiry, could not find how these melancholy matters happened. Several honest travellers were taken up on suspicion and wrongfully hanged upon bare circumstances. Several innocent innkeepers were executed for no other reason than that persons who had been thus lost were known to have lain in their houses, which occasioned a suspicion of their being murdered by them, and their bodies privately buried in obscure places to prevent discovery. Thus an ill-placed justice was executed with the greatest severity imaginable, in order to prevent these frequent atrocious deeds. So many innkeepers who lived on the western road of Scotland left of their business for fear of being made examples of, and followed other employments. This, on the other hand, occasioned many inconveniences to travellers who were now in great distress of accommodation, when they were disposed to refresh themselves and horses, or take up lodging for the night. In a word, the whole country was almost depopulated. Still, the king's subjects were as much missed as before, so that it became the admiration of the whole kingdom how such villainies could be carried out and the perpetrators not discovered. A great many had been executed, not one of them all made any confession at the gallows, but maintained to the last that they were perfectly innocent of the crime for which they suffered. When the magistrates found all was in vain, they left off these rigorous proceedings and trusted wholly to Providence for the bringing to light the authors of these unparalleled barbarities, when it should seem proper to the divine wisdom. Sawney's family was at last grown very large, and every branch of it, as soon as able, assisted in perpetrating their wicked deeds, which they still followed with impunity. Sometimes they would attack 4, 5, or 6 footmen together, but never more than 2 if they were on horseback. They were, moreover, so careful that not one whom they had set upon should escape, that an ambuscade was set on every side to secure them, let them fly which way they would, provided it should ever so happen that one or more got away from the first assailants. How was it possible they should be detected when not one that saw them ever saw anybody else afterwards? The place which they inhabited was quite solitary and lonesome, and when the tide came up, the water went near 200 yards into their subterraneous habitation, which reached almost a mile underground, so that when people who have been sent on to search all the places about have passed by the mouth of the cave, they have never taken any notice of it, never supposing any human being would reside in such a place of perpetual horror and darkness. The number of people these savages destroyed was never exactly known, but it was generally computed that in the 25 years they continued their butcheries, they had washed their hands in the blood of at least 1,000 men, women, and children. The manner they were at last discovered was as follows. A man and his wife behind him on the same horse, coming one evening home from a fair, and falling into the ambuscade of these merciless wretches, they fell upon them in a furious manner. The man, to save himself as well as he could, fought very bravely against them with sword and pistol, riding some of them down by main force of his horse. In the conflict the poor woman fell from behind him and was instantly butchered before her husband's face, for the female cannibals cut her throat and fell to sucking her blood with as great a gusto as if it had been wine. This done, they ripped up her belly and pulled out all her entrails. Such a dreadful spectacle made the man make the more obstinate resistance, as he expected the same fate if he fell into their hands. It pleased Providence, while he was engaged, that 20 or 30 who had been at the same fair came together in a body, upon which Sawney Bean and his bloodthirsty clan withdrew and made the best of their way through a thick wood to their den. This man, who was the first who had ever fell in their way and came off alive, told the whole company what had happened, and showed them the horrid spectacle of his wife, whom the murderers had dragged to some distance, but had not time to carry her entirely off. They were all struck with stupefaction and amazement at what he related. They took him with them to Glasgow and told the affair to the magistrates of that city, who immediately sent to the king concerning it. In about 3 or 4 days after, his Majesty, in person, with a body of about 400 men, set out for the place where this dismal tragedy was acted, in order to search all the rocks and thickets, that, if possible, they might apprehend this hellish crew, which had been so long pernicious to all the western parts of the kingdom. The man who was attacked was the guide, and care was taken to have a large number of bloodhounds with them, that no human means might be wanting towards their putting an entire end to their cruelties. No sign of any habitation was to be found for a long time, and even when they came to the wretch's cave, they took no notice of it, but were going to pursue their search along the seashore, the tide being then out. But some of the bloodhounds luckily entered the Sumerian den, and instantly set up a most hideous barking, howling and yelping, so that the king, with his attendants, came back and looked into it. They could not tell how to conceive that anything human could be concealed in a place where they saw nothing but darkness. Nevertheless, as the bloodhounds increased their noise, they went farther in and refused to come back again. They then began to imagine something or other must inhabit there. Torches were immediately sent for, and a great many men ventured in through the most intricate turnings and windings, till at last they arrived at that private recess from all the world, which was the habitation of these monsters. Now the whole body, or as many of them as could, went in, and were all so shocked at what they beheld that they were almost ready to sink into the earth. Legs, arms, thighs, hands, and feet of men, women, and children were hung up in rows like fried beef. A great many limbs laid in pickle, and a great mass of money, both gold and silver, with watches, rings, swords, pistols, and a large quantity of clothes, both linen and woollen, and an infinite number of other things which they had taken from those they had murdered, were thrown together in heaps or hung up against the sides of the den. Sawney's family at this time, besides himself, consisted of his wife, 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters, who were all begotten in incest. These were all seized and pinioned by His Majesty's order in the first place. Then they took what human flesh they could find, and buried it in the sands. Afterwards, loading themselves with the spoils which they had found, they returned to Edinburgh with their prisoners. All the country, as they passed along, flocked to see this cursed tribe. When they came to their journey's end, the wretches were committed to the Tolbooth, from whence they were the next day conducted under a strong guard to Leith, where they were executed without any process, it being thought needless to try creatures who were even professed enemies to mankind. The men were dismembered, their hands and legs were severed from their bodies, by which amputation they bled to death in a few hours. The wife, daughters, and grandchildren, having been made spectators of this just punishment inflicted on the men, were afterwards burnt to death in 3 several fires. They all in general died without the least signs of repentance, but continued cursing and vending the most dreadful imprecations to the very last gasp of life.